Good evening and welcome to Untitled Church and to our Bible study here in the book of Colossians. So it's been a while since we've been in Colossians, and so we're going to be in Colossians chapter 3. And this will be our last portion of Colossians, and then we will go on to another book next time. So I'm going to start with chapter 3 and verse 12. And go on through chapter 4 and verse 6, and we will end there. So, starting with chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved." So, since we haven't been here for a while, what is the therefore, as they say? And well, it's there because in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Since you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, not on things of the earth, where Christ is seated. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated on the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God." And then he goes on and says, "You've taken off your old self, with its practices, and you've put on a new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. And here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all these things put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, whatever in word or deed, do it all in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him." Okay, so that's kind of the first part. There will probably be three parts that we do here. So the first part, I am calling, using a word here, my own choosing, which is the word tone. And I think the word tone kind of indicates the fact that in communication, right, we have the language, we have the words, but we also have the tone, and we all have the body language. So tone makes a great part of the communication. So what I like to think about this portion in Colossians is that Paul is giving us the tone of what our life needs to be like. And so he mentions a number of things. Number one, he says, clothe yourselves with compassion. Now, this is a different word that is not used a lot in the Bible, but I have a note here on this word. And the word is, it says, it is a poetic form of oiktos that denotes the lamenting that occurs at death or misfortune of another. It expresses the sympathy and pity one felt toward another, often manifested itself in some form of assistance. Out of this context, the word group came to mean showing pity or compassion. So Paul is saying, clothe yourselves with compassion. Well, what is the first word that we come to? Well, the first word is holy. Well, holy means to be set apart for a purpose. What have we been set apart for? We've been set apart because we are now children of God. We are now a chosen people, a chosen generation. We're chosen by the Lord, and now we're to be holy, separate from him. So the tone of our life is now being filled or full of compassion. And it says kindness, humility, Now, humility is that word that Jesus used to describe himself. He says, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. Learn of me, for I am meek and humble in heart, or lowly in heart. And this is the word. So Jesus was the most humble of all men, of all people. And humble means to make yourself low, but it also means not to assess yourself lower than you are, but to assess yourself as you are. Not too high, not too low, but as you are. And who was Jesus? He was the Son of God. So he was assessing himself as he is and as he was, that which was the Son of God. So Paul is saying the tone of your life needs to be separated to God, holy. It needs to be full of compassion. It needs to be full of kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So, and patience is that word that is the word macrothumia, to suffer long. It's the fruit of the Spirit. Many of these in here are fruits of the Spirit. In other words, they don't exist in human beings without the agency of the Spirit of God motivating this inside of a human person. So it's the Spirit of God that is producing in us his fruit, which is humility, which is compassion, which is tenderness, which is kindness, and Paul is saying, therefore, as God's chosen people, clothe yourself with these things: humility, gentleness, patience, bear with each other, and forgive whatever grievances you have against one another. So Paul is establishing a tone of who we are. Now, I understand that in the world that we live in today, and in the kind of world we live in, we as a culture many times are filtering everything that we know many times through politics. Well, Paul is not saying that is who we are. He is saying you're holy, you're set apart. The tone of your life is compassion. The tone of your life is kindness. The tone of your life is gentleness. The tone of your life is humility. And the tone of your life is forgiveness. And it says, bearing with each other, forgiving whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord has forgiven you. Sounds a little bit like the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. In other words, Lord, forgive me as I forgive. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. So this sounds like love is patient, love is kind. It sounds like though I, am able to speak eloquently and I understand mysteries, but I have not love, well, I'm a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. So we're talking about the tone of a person's life, and that person's life is that tone that he has in his life is going to be the prerequisite of the things that he's going to later ask us to do. Paul is going to write to the Colossians in this sense. So it says, let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. There are many things that can have the rulership in our hearts, the things that we're concerned about, the things that we're, sometimes we get agitated about. Well, but he's saying, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. As members of one body, you were called to peace. And be thankful, and let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Paul is saying you are, and we can say we are, you are people of the word. That's who you are. You're people of the word. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Christ in us, the hope of glory. This is who we are. This is our identity. And be thankful, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, as you sing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So I'm just putting this all under the category, these first few verses in the category of tone. This is the tone of the life of a believer. And now Paul is going to talk about individual responsibilities within the community of the people of God. So the first one is, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. So if we look at that passage, this is what was interesting to me, is that the word submit here, wives submit to your husbands, is in what's called the middle voice of the verb. It's not active, it's not passive, but it's in the middle. And what does that mean in the middle? It means there's participation in the action, but the participation is voluntary. It's willingly. In other words, the passage does not read, husbands, make your wives submit. That wouldn't be middle voice. That would be you would be imposing submission upon the wife, and that's not what's being said. What's being said is that the wife must willingly, voluntarily submit. Why? Well, because that's the very nature, that's the tone of Christ. Christ willingly submitted himself to the Father. He humbled himself. He became a man. He endured the cross. He did all these things willingly, humbly. Why? Because he was full of compassion, full of mercy, full of kindness, full of gentleness. And this was the very nature of Christ in how he did his work upon the earth. And now we live in him. And the tone of our life is the tone of Christ in us. Christ is the one in us that is creating, and we, in our participation, in our submission to Christ. Christ cannot force you to be a Christian. Christ cannot force you to love. He cannot force you to submit. He cannot force you to obey. There is no thing like that. That is not the nature or the tone of Christianity. Christianity is voluntary. It's willing. We love him because he first loved us. So this is the tone of what is being said, and that it undergirds everything that Paul is saying. So wives, willingly, voluntarily submit to your husband as is fitting in the Lord. In other words, he's using in the Lord to describe the tone. In other words, the husband needs to be an example of kindness, compassion, mercy, gentleness, humility, and because that is in the very spirit of how Christ submitted to the Father, how wives submit to their husbands. But then it goes on. Now what's interesting here, when he says husbands, when he talks to husbands, he says, husbands, love your wives. It's interesting it's not in the middle voice. It's in the active voice. In other words, you are the one who must love. You must love. loving your wife. It says, and Paul writes about this in Ephesians. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So loving as he loved, this is active. You're actively loving. That's your command. Your command as a husband is to love as Christ loved. Your command is to actively be giving love regardless of whether your wife submits or not. Has nothing to do with it. Christ loved the world. Christ gave himself to the world. He didn't demand us to respond, but he loved, and we respond because of that love. So husbands, love as Christ loved. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Well, why do husbands become harsh? Because they're not getting what they want. Well, they become harsh because they're not getting maybe the respect or the honor, or they're not getting what they need, they believe. But that's not the issue. The issue is not what we're getting, it's what we're giving. It's husbands love. Husbands love. And wives, so he's speaking to husbands, he's speaking to wives, and now he speaks to children. So children, it says obey, another active voice. Children obey. But this is an interesting word about the word obey. The word obey comes from the word hupo, which means under, and kuo, which means to hear. It means to hear under, or to listen. Basically, listen. And so if you think about that word listening, and you think about it in the context of what's being said here, what are children going to be listening to? They're going to be listening to the tone of where they're being raised. Is the tone in which they are being raised a tone of compassion, mercy, kindness, humility, love, respect, submission? Are they living in that tone? Is that the tone that they're growing up in? Because what it says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. So none of this works if it doesn't start off with the right tone. In other words, the husband could be a dictator, but that's not going to work very well with the children. That's not going to work very well with the wife. And what's going to create it's not going to work well. So Paul is saying, and that's why he leads off with this fact, is you're a new creation. You're a new self. Clothe yourselves with compassion and kindness and humility, and do these things, because in that you're creating a tone in which these relationships can work. So wives submit, husbands love, children obey. Children are listening, children are hearing, and they're responding to what they're hearing and listening. It's the responsibility of children to listen, but it's the responsibility of parents to create the tone in which they're listening. So, now, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Do not provoke them. Do not embitter them. Do not exasperate them. Don't be so demanding that they can't function. Don't put them on such an edge that there's no peace in their life. Now, the next one that he comes to in this relationship is slaves. And so, this is written, of course, in the Roman Empire in the 50s and 60s, we'll say, in the first century. And so slavery, there's probably at least 33%, maybe more, of the population were slaves in the Roman Empire. So you've got a lot of slaves. Paul is not saying we're going to change this institution necessarily, but what we are going to do is we're going to create a tone in the relationships that is going to transform the world. And this tone, and this tone that is being created and is being sounded out throughout the whole empire, is going to be the tone of Christ and the Christ in you, the hope of glory. So slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to win their favor. Well, two of the slave and the master are sometimes in the same congregation, in the same group, in the same city, like Onesimus and Philemon, from the same location. Onesimus runs away as a slave, comes to where Paul is. Paul, in relationship with Paul, he is converted. He comes to the Lord. Philemon, the master, is a good friend of Paul's. And so the whole letter to Philemon is about Onesimus being restored to Philemon, and for the relationship between slave and master to be as one would be brotherly in the Lord. So slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do it, not only when their eye is on you to win their favor, but to with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Now, one of the things that I didn't bring out, and I probably should have in this word macrothumia, which is to which we would sometimes translate patience, but it's better translated as long suffering. The idea of that is that this grace of long suffering operates in a situation where there's opposition or there's adversity. When adversity is there, macrothumia kicks in. When there is trouble, macrothumia comes in. When there's hostile, irritable people, macrothumia kicks in, long-suffering or patience. Yeah. So in the slave and the master relationship, the idea here is that, same as the wife and the husband, is that I am going to willingly work for the master, but I'm not going to do it because I have to, but because I must, because I'm now going to think of it as working for the Lord. And I'm going to do whatever I do, whether it's in word or deed, I'm going to do it as to the Lord. Yes, I have a master. Yes, he's over me. Yes, he could control my life. But I'm under the control of the Lord. And whatever happens to me, I am okay with that. I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to live with it, because macrothumia, suffering long, is something that's part of the tone of my life. So, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord. I'm in verse 24. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong. And there is no favoritism. So in other words, Paul is saying, okay, whoever does wrong will be repaid for that. And whoever it is, it can be the master, it could be the slave, it could be the husband, it could be the wife, it could be the child, it could be whoever is doing wrong will be repaid. There is no favoritism. And then he goes on and talks about the masters. So a master could be sitting in the, I mean, obviously they're just this letter is being read, Paul is saying, I want you to read this letter, and then I want you to send it off to Laodicea and read it there as well. So he's saying, masters, provide your slaves for what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Provide, and the words there are equity or equality and justice. Provide, masters, provide for your slaves what is equitable and what is just and right. Well, if there is a master that is and he is a believer, and he is receiving and is participating in this tone of compassion and kindness and holiness and gentleness and forgiveness, and if he is participating in that, then that tone is going to come through his life to the slave. And that slave then will respond to him. Now, so masters provide what is equitable, what is just, what is right, what is fair. And of course, these people, this is 60 AD, 50 in the 60 AD time. And the thing about it is that this community of people, these Christians, are they living, what are the kind of a society are they living in? Well, as I said before, a lot of times we judge everything sometimes politically, but they're living under a dictator right now. They're living under a person that's coming into power real soon is Nero, who's going to kill them, who's going to set them on fire, who's going to take men and women and children and put them into the arena. But what's happening in this adversity? Christianity is thriving. Christianity is growing. Why? Why would it grow? Why would anybody participate in this? Because there's something that's taking place in the very tone of the way their life is now. It has meaning. It has purpose. It has a reason to live. And the reason is that there's Christ in them, the hope of glory. There's something that's more and greater than this life. So they can live through a dictator. They can live through oppression. They can live through suffering because it's not the end of the world. It's the beginning of a new one. And so Christianity in 200 years or more after this time becomes a state-sanctioned religion. And so it, Christianity is thriving. And Paul is saying, in all of these things, husbands and wives, children and parents, slaves and masters, your response to government, to the authorities that are there. You respond in the way Christ would respond, you will be blessed. It doesn't mean so. So anyway, so now he goes on, and we'll finish this here. It says, chapter 4, verse 2. Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Paul is writing this letter, Colossians. He's writing Philemon. He's writing Ephesians. He's writing Philippians from prison. He's in chains. He's writing these things in adversity, in pain, in separation. These words are being written. Why? Because the tone of his life, he is actively and willingly, in the middle voice, willingly participating in this nature of Christ. And because of that, there is this fragrance of his life that is permeating everybody around him. Christ in him is the hope of glory. And the words that he had written, think about it. These words were written almost 2,000 years ago. We're still reading them. They're still active. They're still able to penetrate to the depths of our heart. Because in this word, we are able to see ourselves. And when we see ourselves in the light of the word, where are we? Well, we're kind of haven't completely measured up, because what's being described in the tone that I mentioned in the beginning, this is not just human life. This is the tone of Christ in me. This is the tone of God in you. It's the tone of a divine life in a human person. And that tone is created by Christ in you. Nothing else can do that. No one can do that on their own. Impossible. But only Christ can do it in you. So he says, we proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I'm in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity, and let your conversation or your way of life be always full of grace. Full of grace. That sounds familiar. John said about Jesus, he was full of grace and truth. Let your conversation, let your way of life, let the tone of your life always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. So, and maybe if you just think about the idea that the tone of your life is that aspect of your life where you are willingly participating in the nature of Christ. You're not trying to improve your human nature on your own. You're willingly participating. You're submitting to the life of Christ in you. You're putting on a new self. Paul says, clothe yourselves with these things: humility and compassion and mercy and kindness and forgiveness and love. You're participating in it. You're allowing these things to happen in you. And then you are actively, as a husband, loving your wife. As a child, you're obeying your parents. As a slave, you're obeying your master. As a wife, you're willingly submitting. And these things are all working in human relationships so that the fragrance of Christ will permeate you, those you touch, your family, your community, and eventually your world. And eventually it did. And it always will, as long as Christ is at the head and we put him first. And so I close maybe with this verse, and this verse is from the book of Colossians, and it's chapter 3, verse 1. I read it in the beginning. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above. That sounds like Jesus that said, seek first the kingdom. Seek first the kingdom. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated on the right hand of God. In other words, you can't do that unless you believe that Jesus died and rose again and ascended. You're not going to set your heart on things above if you don't believe that they're there. You're going to set your heart on things above because you believe Christ is risen. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Sounds like what Paul is saying is that this world is not the end. This world is only the beginning. It's only where we are in the training room. We're only being tested and tried, and there's adversity and there's trouble and all these things. But actually those things are working to our benefit, because in that adversity, in that stress, in that trial, in that trouble, something is taking place. And that is Christ in us is growing. He is working in us. Because Christ, when he came into the world, it wasn't cushy for him. It says that he endured the cross for the joy that was set before him. So, and I'm going to finish there and close there. And I believe that maybe, I don't know if I did in this online presentation, but we in our live Bible study, we closed with we began the study with chapter 4, verse 7, and talked about all the different people that Paul was associated with and were part of the book of Colossians. And that's chapter 4, verse 7 through 18, which you can read on your own. So next week we're going to continue in a Bible study, but we're going to be in the book of Philippians. As I mentioned, these books are written from prison, and these are all written about the same time frame. And so we will be looking into Philippians. It'll be a really good book, and I always like to think of the top 10 verses of Philippians, and we'll hit at least 10. So, well, God bless you, and thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for joining us, and keep yourselves in the love of God and also in the Word of God. Thank you.